"My son's cold. Can I borrow your scarf?" the widow asked the rich rancher at the station on Christmas Day, Christmas Eve, 1877. A remote train station somewhere in the cold heart of Wyoming territory. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, the kind that settled into the silence like it meant to stay. The sun was long gone, and the light of the gas lamps flickered against the thickening white. Viola Bennett sat stiffly on a wooden bench outside the station office, clutching her 3-year-old son, James, close to her chest. Her fingers trembled around the thin wool blanket it wrapped around them both, but it was clear it was not enough. James whimpered against her collarbone, his lips pale, his tiny fingers ice cold despite her efforts to warm them. Her own coat was thin, fraying at the edges, more a suggestion of warmth than the real thing. They were the last ones off the train. Everyone else had been met with hugs, wagons, laughter, even barking dogs. One by one, they had disappeared into the snow. But not her, not them. Viola glanced at the worn letter, folded in her skirt pocket. The promise of a new beginning from a man she had never seen. "Come to Dry Creek, be my wife, I'll care for you and your boy." GP, it was all she had, that and her son. That was enough. James stirred. "Mama," he whispered. "I cold." Her heart twisted. She looked up, scanning the platform for anyone. Someone who looked like they were waiting. Someone who might be looking for her. But the only people left were a tired porter and a tall man sitting under the awning's edge. He wore a thick dark coat lined with fur and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind. A thick scarf was wrapped snugly around his neck, woolen and dark blue. She hesitated, then stood, holding James tighter. She stepped closer, her voice low, uncertain. "Excuse me, my son is cold. Could I borrow your scarf?" The man lifted his head slowly. His eyes were a pale steel gray beneath the shadow of his hat, catching the station's lamp glow just enough to glint. He looked at her, then at James, at the small bundle of boy with flushed cheeks and shivering shoulders. Without a word, he unraveled the scarf from around his neck. His hands were gloved, but moved gently, and he passed it over with a nod. Viola blinked. "Thank you." He still said nothing, but his gaze lingered a second longer than expected, softening. She crouched down and wrapped the scarf carefully around James' neck and up to his ears. It was warm, still held the man's heat. James sniffled, curling into it like a kitten into fur. The man stood suddenly. Viola looked up, startled. He didn't look at her again. Instead, he walked past toward the bench closer to the station's meager heater, a small iron stove hissing faintly behind a wrought gate. Then he paused, turned around, and gestured to the bench he had just vacated. "For you," he said at last. His voice was deep and deliberate, like it came from a place unused to much use. Viola stared. "Sir, that is not necessary," but he had already moved to the farther end of the platform, sat down on a crate near the open side, where the wind cut sharper, and looked away. She sat slowly on still warm bench, pulling James onto her lap. The stove's warmth reached them, not fully, but enough. James sighed and laid his head against her shoulder. Viola looked at the scarf again, then at the man in the distance. He had no scarf now. His coat was fine, yes, but the wind was merciless tonight. She whispered to herself, barely a breath, "Merry Christmas." The man did not look back, but she saw one gloved hand move slightly, as if acknowledging the words, or maybe the wind had shifted. Either way, something small, something that mattered, had passed between strangers on a cold Christmas night, and it was only the beginning. The train hissed one last time as it came to a stop, steam curling into the crisp afternoon air. Viola stood up slowly, tightening her grip on James' hand as other passengers gathered their things. Laughter echoed across the platform as families found each other, arms wrapping around shoulders, voices rising in reunion. Viola stayed back, watching the joy unfold like a scene from someone else's life. She lifted James into her arms, his little body already shivering despite the layers. He clung to her coat, eyes darting around the station. "Is that him?" he asked in a small voice, pointing to a man hugging a woman in a red bonnet. Viola shook her head. "No, sweetheart. We wait a little longer." They stood still as the crowd thinned. Wagons rolled away, voices faded, and the laughter was replaced by the quiet crackle of wind through frozen trees. Still, no one came. She moved toward the station master, who was scribbling notes at his desk near the ticket window. "Excuse me," Viola said, adjusting James on her hip. "Is there anyone else expected from Dry Creek?" The man looked up with a half-apologetic shrug. "No, ma'am. No one from Dry Creek came for a bride today." She blinked, but there must be some mistake. "Sorry," he said, already looking back at his papers. Viola turned away, her breath catching. She walked back to the bench, sat down, and tried to keep her face from crumpling. James whimpered softly against her collarbone. "I'm hungry," he whispered. "I know, baby." "I know." From across the platform, the man in the fine coat, the same one who had given up his scarf, watched. He had not left with the others. His hat was pulled low against the wind, his coat dusted with snow, but he had not taken his eyes off the young woman and her son. Now he stepped forward, quiet and steady. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was low, but carried easily in the still air. "Are you Viola Bennett?" She looked up, startled. "Yes." He nodded once. "I thought so. I recognized the name from town. The man who was supposed to meet you, he's known in Dry Creek." Viola tensed, and he hesitated, then said simply, "Let's just say you're lucky he didn't come." Her grip on James' coat tightened. "I see. I'm Thomas Hale," he continued. "I own a ranch a few miles north. My wife passed some years ago. No children." Viola looked at him cautiously, unsure of why he was telling her this. Thomas glanced at James, whose face was pressed into his mother's shoulder. "I was here picking up supplies." "I didn't expect." He stopped, shifted his weight. "No one should be left like that, especially not on Christmas." She studied him, her eyes guarded. "We'll figure something out." "I'm sure you will," he said gently, "but you do not have to do it alone." For a moment, nothing moved but the wind. Then James lifted his head, eyes wide and curious. He looked at Thomas, then down at the snow-covered tracks stretching off into the distance. "Are you our train now?" he asked, his voice small but clear. The words hit Thomas like a stone dropped into deep water. He didn't speak right away. His gaze flicked to Viola, who was frozen in place, then back to James. He crouched down slowly until he was at eye level with the boy. "I do not know if I am," he said softly, "but I can wait at the station, for as long as you need." James blinked, then reached out and took hold of Thomas's gloved finger, wrapping his tiny hand around it. Viola's breath caught. For a moment, the ache in her chest lightened. Thomas stood, James still holding his hand. "I am heading into town now," he said. "There's a place where you can stay warm, at least for the night." Viola looked at her son, then back at the man she'd never planned to meet. And in that breathless space between heartbreak and hope, she nodded. The snow was falling harder now, the flakes thicker, swirling fast across the empty platform. Viola pulled James close, trying to keep him shielded from the wind. But she could feel the cold creeping through both their coats. Thomas stood silently for a moment after James' words, then looked toward the darkened town. "The roads will be ice by nightfall," he said. "There's an inn 2 blocks up, clean place. I can take you both there. Viola tightened her arms around James. We don't want to trouble you. It's not trouble, he replied. I don't even know you. That's fair, he said, then added. But I figure knowing someone takes time, and you won't have that if you freeze. She hesitated. Pride weared with reason. She was a mother first, and James' cheeks were too pale. All right, she said softly, just for the night. Thomas nodded, then led them toward his buggy. It was a sturdy black rig with thick wool blankets in the back. He helped Viola in gently, careful of her hesitation, then lifted James onto her lap and tucked the blankets around them both. Viola avoided his gaze as he climbed up beside them and clicked the reins. They rode in silence for a few minutes, hooves crunching over the snow-covered road. The lamps of the station faded behind them. Dry Creek wasn't much of a town, just a line of low buildings with gaslight flickering in the dusk. As they turned a corner, Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a small paper packet. Ginger biscuits, he said, offering them toward James. Still warm, James' eyes lit up. He took one and cradled it in his mittened hands like it was gold. Viola watched her son smile for the first time that day. You're good with children, she said, then caught herself, not sure if she was crying. Thomas didn't look at her. I've had practice, not enough. She didn't ask what he meant. He didn't explain that she appreciated. By the time they arrived at the inn, the wind had grown sharper. Thomas dismounted, tied the horse quickly, and then helped them both down without a word. Inside, the warmth was a balm. The innkeeper glanced up, surprised to see them. Room for lady and child, Thomas said. 3 nights I'll pay now. Viola opened her mouth to protest, but he looked at her calm, steady. She let him. Upstairs, the room was plain but warm. A small stove crackled in the corner. James was already dozing off, biscuit crumbs on his coat. Viola laid him gently onto the bed, tucking a quilt around him, then turned to Thomas, who lingered at the door. You've done more than enough, she said quietly. We won't trouble you long. Thomas shrugged. I don't see any trouble here. She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to exhale. The next morning, the sky was overcast, and the snow had not let up. Viola bundled James tightly, left him with the innkeeper's wife for a short while, and walked alone toward the town's central office. She needed answers. She had memorized the man's name, Jonathan Reed. He was supposed to meet her, supposed to offer a new beginning. Instead, she had stepped off that train into silence. At the town clerk's office, she asked for him. The woman at the counter gave her a look that was both awkward and familiar. He doesn't live here anymore, the woman said. Left town 2 weeks ago, said he was headed south. No forwarding address. Viola's chest tightened. He was supposed to meet me. I was to marry him. The woman blinked, then leaned closer. You're the male bride. The words dropped like a brick. Viola turned away before the sympathy could reach her. As she stepped out onto the street, she heard murmurs from behind the frosted windows. Curiosity, pity, even a chuckle. Every face she passed seemed to hold a whisper. By the time she reached the inn again, her hands were stiff from the cold, but her pride stung worse. She sat by the stove and pressed her fingers against her lips, trying to keep herself together. That evening, Thomas returned. He didn't ask where she had been. He only said dinner. She hesitated, then nodded. The dining room downstairs was lit with lanterns and soft laughter. Locals filled a few tables, mostly quiet. The 3 of them took a small corner spot. Viola tried not to notice how people glanced their way when Thomas walked in. Whispers again, but different this time. Thomas ordered stew and cornbread. James nestled in between them, playing with the spoon on the table. Want to hear a cow? Thomas asked suddenly. James' eyes widened. Thomas puffed up his cheeks and let out a loud moo. James burst into giggles. Thomas followed with a series of snorts, clucks, and a very convincing hoarse whinny. Viola laughed, unable to stop herself. The entire table was shaking with joy. Across the room, a few heads turned. One older man stared, stunned. Another whispered that Thomas hail. Viola leaned closer. You're full of surprises. Thomas gave a sheepish smile. That boy made me laugh. It's been a while. She caught his tone, gentle beneath the humor, and something in her chest softened. After dinner, the wind had picked up outside. Snowflakes danced hard in the gaslight. Viola reached for James, but the boy had already curled up in his coat, half asleep against the bench. Thomas reached out carefully, lifting James with ease. The boy murmured something, then went limp against his shoulder, head resting near Thomas's neck. They walked in silence through the snow. Viola followed slightly behind, watching the way Thomas adjusted the blanket around James' legs, the way he turned his shoulder toward the wind so the child's face was shielded. The snow coated his coat and hat, settled onto his boots. Each step he took was steady, certain. Viola stopped for a breath, just a few paces behind. In that moment, the image before her held still, the quiet strength of a man walking through a storm, carrying someone else's child like his own. He looks like someone we could belong to, she thought. Then softly she walked forward. That night, the wind howled louder than usual, and the snow came harder against the windows of the inn. Viola sat on the edge of the narrow bed. James cradled in her arms. His forehead was burning. He whimpered softly, twisting and turning against her chest. She tried everything. Cool cloths, whispered songs, soft humming, but his fever climbed. His small hands clutched her dress tightly, and his breath turned shallow. There was no doctor at the inn, no telegraph operator on duty. It was Christmas week. People were gone, resting, celebrating. Viola's heart pounded, panic rising with every minute. A knock came. She opened the door to find Thomas. He took one look at James and said, "Get your coat, but I have medicine, and someone who can help." She didn't argue. The snow was thick, the wind brutal. Thomas helped her into the sleigh and wrapped blankets tight around both of them. James lay in her arms, eyes fluttering closed. They rode in silence, save for the jingle of the harness and the creak of the sleigh. Viola didn't speak. She kept her eyes on her son's face, trying not to cry. An hour later, lanterns glowed through the dark. The Hale Ranch. The house stood tall and warm among pine trees dusted with snow. As Thomas helped them inside, Viola was struck by how alive it felt. Not just clean or well kept, but lived in. A fire glowed in the hearth, and the scent of herbs and wood smoke filled the air. An older woman appeared from the back hall, her sleeves rolled up and glasses perched low. "This the boy?" she asked. "Bring him here." Thomas led Viola into a cozy bedroom. The woman, Mrs. Emery, once a nurse, took over with quiet efficiency. She dabbed James' forehead, checked his pulse, and opened a drawer full of vials and jars. Viola stood awkwardly to the side, unsure if she was intruding. Thomas gestured toward a chair. "Sit, you're not leaving his side." She sat. Her eyes scanned the room. There were photos on the dresser, one of Thomas and a beautiful woman, both smiling. Dried flowers hung by the window, and a child's rocking horse stood in the corner, untouched by dust. Viola swallowed. This was someone's room, someone who had been loved and lost. He was 4, Thomas said quietly. When he got sick, Viola looked up. "I buried him on a day not much colder than this." She couldn't speak. Thomas turned toward the small bed where James now slept under layers of clean blankets. The room had once belonged to his son, and now he was offering it again. "He deserves better than a train station floor," Thomas said softly. Viola stared at him, her throat tight. He didn't look at her, just stood there, one hand resting gently on the headboard. This wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was a man sharing the one thing he had protected above all memory. She moved closer, sat by James, and brushed a strand of hair from his face. His breathing had steadied. The fever was still there, but fading slowly. Mrs. Emery returned with tea for Viola. Thomas took his coat off, hung it by the fire. In the warmth of that house, Viola didn't feel like a guest. She felt like she'd stepped into a story paused long ago, and gently allowed to continue. The days grew longer as the snow began to melt in patches around the ranch, revealing earth beneath. James, once pale and fevered, now ran through the fields with wild laughter, cheeks flushed with health. His boots kicked up the slush and dirt, and his little hat tilted sideways as he chased after the chickens or tried to herd the cat. Thomas watched from the porch, a rare smile curving his lips. Viola beside him folded laundry fresh from the line. The winter still hung in the air, but inside the house something had shifted. Warmer now, lighter. James had taken to Thomas quickly like roots seeking water. They fished by the creek behind the ranch. James tugging at his two big boots and proudly declaring, "Bet I catch the biggest one today, partner." Thomas had responded with a playful growl. "Not if I beat you to it, cowboy." Later, they drew together at the kitchen table, James sketching clumsy horses, while Thomas added careful lines and details. Viola would glance over, hiding her smile as James whispered seriously, "This one's got your hat, Mr. Hale. See." He had stopped calling him Sir days ago. Now it was always Thomas or partner. Viola, meanwhile, had quietly begun tending to the house, not out of duty, but instinct. She mended curtains, cleaned out the pantry, and one afternoon replanted the long abandoned flower bed beneath the kitchen window. "I thought these were all dead," Thomas had said, crouching beside her. "Sometimes roots just wait," Viola replied, brushing dirt from her hands. "They bloom when they feel safe again." The ranch hands noticed, too. The cook smiled more. The barn boys lingered at meals to hear James' stories. And the neighbors, well, they had their opinions. Whispers crept in from town. People said Thomas Hale, the rich widower, had brought a mail-order bride reject into his home. Some called it pity, others scandal. A few selfishly called it a waste. The man once thought untouchable was giving his name, maybe his land, to a stranger with nothing but a boy. Viola heard them, saw it in the glances, felt it in the weight of silence when she walked into the general store. She returned one afternoon, arms full of flour and salt, finding Thomas at the gate, fists tight at his sides. "They think I'm a fool," he muttered, "for trusting you, for letting you stay. They think you're just here because you were abandoned." Viola laid the bags down and looked up at him. "I was," she said simply, "but that does not make me ashamed, and you do not need to defend me." Thomas's jaw flexed. "I'm not defending you." He stepped closer, voice low. "I'm defending what I hope to keep." Viola's breath caught. She did not answer. She couldn't, not with words. Instead, she reached for his hand, calloused and warm, and held it for a moment longer than necessary. That evening they sat on the porch, watching James ride a stick horse across the yard. "Do you ever regret staying?" Thomas asked quietly. Viola smiled, not once, then softly. She added, "But I didn't think I would be chosen again. Not like this." Thomas turned toward her. "You were not just chosen. You were meant." She looked at him, at the man who had once handed over a scarf without a word, who had given her child a bed and herself a place without asking for anything back. And for the first time in years, Viola believed she was not surviving. She was living. James whooped as he tumbled into the grass, laughing. Thomas grinned, called out, "You all right there, partner?" James popped up, head askew, still winning. Viola laughed. So did Thomas. And beneath the last rays of the setting sun, the porch felt like a place they could all belong. It was 3 days after Christmas when the snow eased, and the road cleared enough for a visitor to make his way up the path to Hale Ranch. Viola was kneading dough in the kitchen when she saw the horse outside and called, For Thomas, Thomas wiped his hands and stepped out just as a man in a dark wool coat dismounted and tipped his hat. Pastor Whitmore, Thomas greeted, his voice neutral. Afternoon, Thomas. The pastor said, I was hoping you'd come to the Christmas gathering, but I figured if you didn't, I'd come to you. Thomas nodded, waiting. We're holding a late service tomorrow, the pastor continued, brushing snow from his shoulders. There'll be carols, supper, maybe a little laughter, and the kids are singing. Thomas hesitated. I'm not much for crowds. I figured as much, the pastor said, smiling slightly, but you've been missed. From the window, James pressed his nose to the glass. A party, he asked, with songs. Viola came up behind him. It's a church service, sweetheart. James turned to Thomas. Can we go? Thomas looked from the boy to Viola. He wasn't sure what he saw in her eyes. Caution maybe, or concern, but James' hope was bright, wide open. All right, partner, he said, we'll go. The next evening, the small church was already aglow when the buggy arrived. Gas lanterns lit the path, and the sound of laughter and music drifted into the cold night air. People paused when Thomas entered, Viola at his side, James walking proudly between them, holding both their hands, heads turned. Some whispered. It was the first time in years Thomas Hale had walked into town during a holiday, and never like this. Viola kept her chin high, her expression calm. She didn't let go of Thomas's hand. Even when they took their seats, the service began with hymns. Children were called to the front to sing. James looked at Viola, nervous. She shook her head gently, but he stood anyway, legs shaking. Viola reached for him, but Thomas stopped her, resting a firm hand on James' small shoulder. Go ahead, partner, he said softly. You've got this. James looked up, then took a step forward. Other children were louder, more confident. James' voice trembled at first, but as he sang, it steadied, small but clear. The church fell silent. The moment stretched. When he finished, James walked back, face glowing red with pride and nerves. Viola swept him into her arms. Thomas reached over, ruffled his hair. The rest of the service passed in a warm hush, filled with soft prayers and candlelight. Afterward, as the townsfolk gathered for warm cider and cookies, Pastor Whitmore approached them near the back pew. He looked between Thomas and Viola, then down at James, clinging to both their hands. Are you two a family now? He asked quietly. Thomas didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to Viola, threaded his fingers through hers, and squeezed gently. She looked at him, surprised, but she didn't let go. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, light, slow, as if blessing the earth. They walked back to the buggy in silence. James nestled between them, already half asleep. Viola laid a hand on his head, smoothing his hair. Thomas helped her into the seat, then lifted James up and tucked a blanket around them both. Before climbing in, he paused, glancing back at the glowing windows of the church. A late Christmas, he murmured, but maybe right on time. Viola reached out and touched his arm. Sometimes, she said, the best gifts aren't the ones you expect. He looked down at her, then smiled, quiet full. Or the ones you think you deserve. She didn't answer, but her hand found his again, and this time she was the one who held on tight. The snow had started again by the time they returned to the ranch. The wind gentle now. The world softened under a fresh white quilt. Thomas helped Viola down from the buggy, his hands steady, warm against hers. James tumbled out last, half asleep, but smiling. Inside the cabin glowed with a quiet kind of warmth. Not just from the fire, but from something slower, deeper, a sense of belonging that neither of them had expected to find here. Not like this. James ran to the hearth rug and turned back with bright eyes. Can we stay forever? He asked, throwing his arms around Thomas's leg. Viola started to speak, to deflect, to soften the moment. But Thomas answered before she could. Only if your mama says yes, he said, voice low, his eyes not leaving hers. Viola felt something still inside her chest. He had not asked for anything more than she could give. He hadn't demanded, hadn't promised. He only waited, quiet and open. She took a breath, reached into her satchel, and pulled out the old scarf, the one he had handed her at the station that first bitter night without words or expectation. "This kept us warm," she said, holding it out to him. "Maybe it's time it stayed here." Thomas stepped closer. He took the scarf from her hands, but instead of folding it away, he placed it gently back into hers and closed her fingers around it. "Then maybe you stay, too." They stood there for a long moment, surrounded by fire, light, and silence. James, unaware of the weight of what had just passed, ran toward the door and threw it open. Snowflakes danced in the wind as he shouted into the open land, voice high with joy, "Mama, we have a ranch now." Viola moved to the doorway, her hand still holding the scarf. She watched James leap and spin, chasing snowflakes like wild little dreams. "No," she whispered, "we have a home." Thomas stepped behind her. Close but not crowding. He didn't speak, but his presence said everything. Later that evening, they had a quiet supper. Just soup, bread, and a few dried apples, but it felt like a feast. James dozed off beside the hearth again, his head in Viola's lap. She brushed a curl from his cheek, then looked at Thomas. "You didn't have to do any of this." Thomas, sitting across from her, met her eyes without hesitation. "I know. Why did you?" He looked down at the fire, then back at her. "Because when I saw you at that station, I thought, this isn't someone who needs saving. This is someone who's been saving herself for too long. And maybe I just wanted to be someone worth staying for." Viola felt tears press behind her eyes, not from sadness, but from something older, softer, and just as rare. "I never thought I'd belong anywhere again," she said. Thomas rose, crossed the room, and sat beside her on the floor. He touched her hand lightly. "You belong here. If you want to." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in silence, the kind that spoke louder than words ever could. Outside, the snow kept falling, not heavy, not harsh, just enough to cover the past and make everything ahead feel new. In that cabin, with a fire burning and a child sleeping between them, two people who had lost nearly everything realized they had just found what mattered most. And it had come, perhaps late, perhaps unexpected, but exactly when they were ready. Thank you for riding with us through this heartwarming Christmas journey. A tale of quiet love blooming in silence, of second chances offered not with grand gestures but with steady hands and kind eyes, and of warmth found not in roaring fires, but in small unexpected mercies. Viola, James, and Thomas reminded us that family is not always bound by blood, but by choice, by courage, and by shared moments of grace. If this story touched your heart, hit that hype button to let us know you were here. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more timeless tales of hope, redemption, and romance under wide skies. Until next time, partner, may your trails be warm and your heart even warmer.